Hi everybody, I'm Biant from INRAE France. I'm working with Olivier Britrac and Mike Nguyen from the LME. And today I'm going to present you some data about the safety assessment of bio-based materials. I focus on the limits of current regulations, even if the previous presentation was about this regulation, the current testing procedures, and the future outlooks. So I wanted to start with a quick question. So why are bio-based materials popular? Here you can see 5 different abstracts of articles that were published in the early 70s. They all talk about plastic materials, and on the left of the slide, you see that plastic could be a threat to human health, particularly to blood and biological systems. And on the right of the slide, you can see that plastic can be a threat for the environment. So today we all know this, but in the early 70s, it was really the first time that we saw the crisis about plastic pollution and that plastic could be a threat to the human health. So everything started from this, from a crisis. And today we are using bio-based materials to face all these problems caused by plastic. So what are bio-based materials? They can be from renewable resources. So for example, from starch, from linen, from oil, proteins, or others like sugar. And they can be from, for example, biological systems like chitosan, which comes from shellfish, or for example, PHAs that comes from food waste. They can be bioplastics. That's something that we hear a lot nowadays. So bioplastics are there are many bioplastics. Some can be biodegradable, others are not biodegradable. But what we want to see here is that some are bio-based, like for example PLA, polylactic acid, which is the most known today and the most used today. Bio-based materials can, of course, be plant-based materials, for example, from bamboo fibers. With bamboo fibers, for example, we can manufacture lunch boxes. And also, what interests us today, bio-based materials can also be from paper fibers, so paper and cardboard. But bio-based materials, of course, they can be biosourced, they can be biodegradable, but they are also physically and chemically modified. So we can use biopolymers, so starch, cellulose, PLA, bioplastics, we talked about this, and we use reinforcement fillers and other chemicals to make the packaging after. So it's not because it's biosourced that it's I would say green, because they are modified. So if they are chemically modified, are finally bio-based materials safe, or at least safer than plastics? Because I just remember you that everything started from plastics. The answer obviously is no, they are not safe at all, because we have many examples of contamination. As Christian talked about mineral oils contamination, and I will just open the subject on others contaminants. Here you have an example of a study of contamination of 28 samples made in the Netherlands. So they analyzed the concentration of contaminants in paper and paperboard, in packaging made of wood, of bamboo, of other biosourced other biosources like banana leaves, cocoa shells, and also some bioplastics, PLA. The results are appealing. 10 of the 28 samples contain active substances and contaminants, and most of these substances are not authorized in the lists of the European Union. And 3 of these were packaging or components that have direct oral exposures because they are straws. In terms of contaminants, today we have the PFAs that are known as new contaminants because they are eternal contaminants. And they are not authorized today for food contact materials. And they were found in some of these articles, so even in biosourced articles. So just as a quick conclusion, we can say that bio-based materials, they may contain substances, not all, but some contain substances, and this gives rise to a health concern because some of these articles are not authorized and can be dangerous for the human health. So here you have an overview of the contaminants that can be found in bio-based materials. So they could be residues, they could be natural toxins, nanoparticles, active chemicals, some allergens, or genetically modified materials. So you have a broad range of molecules and contaminants that could be in bio-based materials. So as a conclusion, we can just say that bio-based materials are not less chemical than others like plastic. And if they are contaminated, how are they regulated? We just had a previous presentation that was really complete about this, but I just want to give a general overview on what exists today. I took the examples of two restrictions. So from one side, you have the European Union, and on the other side, the United States. In the European Union, you have the regulation 1935 from the year 2004, which is a general regulation on food contact materials. You have the one from 2011, which focuses more on plastic, and you also have EFSA guidelines. And for the United States, you have recommendations from the FDA. So in the EU, in the European regulation, what do you have? You have a food contact material law, which is the one from 2004, and one from good manufacturing practices to produce food packaging from 2006. And all these regulations are very general, not specific, even if there are specific measures for only three groups of materials that are organic, fibrous, and inorganic, but they are not general from one type of material, like paper and board, for example. And there is a paradox because the general regulation distinguishes 17 types of materials that may come into contact with food. And among these 17 types of materials, you can have 11 of them that could be biosourced. So you have 11 groups of different materials that are in the European regulation, but you don't have a specific regulation for each type of this packaging. And so just as I said, there is no harmonized regulation for bio-based food contact materials, and you have no specific regulation. But on the other side, you also have standards for bio-based materials. So at the European scale, the European Commission put some standards on what is a bio-based product, how can we name a bio-based product, how can we just examine or assess a bio-based product. So we have a standard for bio-based materials, but we don't have standards for the assessment of this product when it comes to food contact materials. And so since this material are seen as alternative to plastics, I will focus today because it's the purpose of the webinar on paper and cardboard. So what are the existing regulations and what are the risks associated to these materials? So today, for paper and cardboard, as it was said before in the previous presentation, you have a positive list of substances that can be in the food contact materials. So you have one at the European scale, and here it's from the BFR of Germany. So you have a list for Germany. You also have the same for France, which is not the same list. So you can have specific guidelines from one country to another. And so now that we know that there are a lot of contaminants and that we should focus on, so, and that, yeah, there are a lot of contaminants, and they are not the same in every country. So what do we know about the contamination in general? What are the routes for contaminants and what are the relationships with the properties of the contaminants? So about the migration pathways, today, as Christian talked about it, we can have several mechanisms of contamination. Just imagine that you have a board, which is your food contact material, and you have the food. So the contaminants, they can go from the board to the food by the gas phase or by direct contact. They can go through a plastic film via permeation, and they can go also from the board to the food via the air, the plastic, and the air. So many studies have studied this phenomenon, and more particularly the migration. So how a board loses some contaminants and how the food associated takes the contaminant. So this is migration. So here you have example of the study for a board in contact with some pasta and some cereals. So for pasta, you have just the board, a layer of air and the food. And for cereals, you have a plastic layer that should be a barrier to the contamination. But as we can see, for several temperatures of migration, there is still contamination of food after hundreds of days. Here, this is another study that was done recently for how can we assess the migration pathways and the mechanisms of contamination. So for different contaminants, you can see at the top some alkanes, some phthalates, some antioxidants, and some MOH. The lines are associated to the model that was developed for the study and the points for the contamination. So again, we can see that in different conditions, we have a lot of contamination. And here, the mechanisms developed by the model sticks to the reality of experimental contamination. So now that we talk about this and that we know that there is a contamination and that we can assess this contamination even from the paper and board to the food, what are the emerging risks? We talked a lot about recycling, that recycled paper and board can be also contaminated by the previous use of the paper. So there are emerging risks associated to the use of recycled matter into these food contact materials, and also associated to how can we assess this new contamination, if I can say this. So here is just a list of contaminants that were found recently in paper and board materials. So you can see on the left, of course, mineral oils like MOSH, MOA, and the IPNs that are the isopropyl naphthalenes that are really a marker of the contamination by recycled fibers and also other products. And so what are recycled fibers? So we looked inside the packaging, really, that we studied in this study. And so what really are recycled fibers? So here you have an example of popcorn packaging and microscopic images of its thickness. So we can clearly see that the fibers are colored. And I'm sorry if it's small on your screen, but on the top right image of this slide, you can see that there are several dots of contamination that are colored, that are fibers that were used before and printed. And during the recycling process, there are no decontamination, even if there is a de-inking process. So we can still have some ink after the recycling process, and the fibers are still contaminated. And so the European Union proposed, not the European Union, sorry, here it's the guideline for paper and board assessment for the articles of paper and board for food contact. And here, what they propose is to use new methodologies to detect the contamination of paper and cardboard by recycled materials. So here on the right, what you can see is that there are one material that is virgin and one material that is recycled. And on the material that is recycled, if we put it on under UV light, we can see spots of contamination that corresponds to the pigments and the printing inks that are here because of the recycling process. So that's what we tried to do with another type of microscope, which is a confocal laser scanning microscope, which doesn't use the UV light, but some fluorescence light to detect the contamination. And here, what you can see is that there are clearly colored points on the left in the fibers of this popcorn packaging. And if we use the fluorescence of the fluorescence microscope, here you have on the right the 4 images in false colors, and you have to understand that every colored dot is a spot of contamination. So with this technique, we can clearly see that this popcorn packaging is recycled because we have typical spots of contamination of printing inks, and that these spots of contamination are different from one part to another of the packaging. And so that's the new emerging risks. That's the fact that recycled materials, they can bring the contamination heterogeneously. So from one part to another of the packaging, the contamination is distributed and not homogeneously. And so another technique to detect where are the contaminants, here it's to detect the aromatic contaminants. So it's particularly interesting because the MOA, the mineral oil aromatic hydrocarbons, are in fact aromatic. So here you can use Raman microspectroscopy. So that's also microscopy. So you can see clearly the image of your material, and it's combined to Raman spectroscopy that allows to have a fingerprint of your contamination because it gives you information about the chemical structure. So here you have at the top a spectra of non-contaminated fibers, so only a spectra of cellulose, which is paper and board, and at the bottom you have the spectra of contaminated fibers. And if you take the difference between these two fibers, around 1600 centimeter minus 1, you have a peak of contamination that corresponds to the peak of aromatic molecules. And the scale that you can see on this image with red, green, and blue colors is the fingerprint of contamination of this paper and of this cardboard packaging. In red, you have the areas where the concentration of aromatic molecules is high, and in blue, you have the areas where the contamination is low. So again, you can see that with this technique, we clearly see that there is a very heterogeneous distribution of contaminants along the thickness of this packaging. So just to conclude, some takeaways about the rules and what I just said. So about the regulations, we saw that materials can be regulated alone or in combination with other materials. For example, by list of substance, by purity standards for these substances, and by overall migration limits or specific migration limits. And there are also other rules that ensure the safety and inertness of these materials, but it's not general for the European Union, for example. It's in different countries. And that we have different methods and techniques to study the migration modeling or to study the contamination. For plastic materials, we have a regulation that is really exclusive to plastics, which is specific. But when it comes to adapt this regulation to other type of materials, and particularly here to paper and board or other bio-sourced or bio-based materials, it's a gray regulation because it's quite not adaptable. And so today, the voluntary approaches to assess the safety of paper and board food contact materials is to focus on the printing inks and the mineral oils, because as we saw just before, there are contaminants of concern, and also we can assess them with new strategies and with new methodologies. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention.